Black History Month.
It's Black History
I'm just going to give you a little
Today's video
recap,
is
a
dedicated to
little
all my brothers
history.
and
As the
sisters.
great migration of African Americans made its way north, New York City's Harlem neighborhood became a vibrant hotspot for musicians, writers, entertainers, and thinkers. The collection of talent, all within a few city blocks, became known as the Harlem Resonance, lasting between the 1910s and the mid 1930s. The influence of the time is still felt today. Second, I will talk about education and access to information during 400 years of slavery of Africans or black people. Slave owners, even though they proclaimed American slavery to be benevolent, greatly feared slave rebellions. Most of them sought to minimize slaves' exposure to the outside world to reduce the risk. The desired result was to eliminate slaves' dreams and aspirations, restrict access to information about escaped slaves and rebellions, and education of slaves then was at least discouraged and usually prohibited. It was seen by slave owners as something that enslaved, like other farm animals, did not need to do their job. They believed slaves with knowledge would become morose, if not insolent and uppity. They might learn of the Underground Railroad that escape was possible. In 1881, Virginia punished violations of this law by 20 lashes to the slave and a $100 fine to the teacher, and North Carolina by 39 lashes to the slave and a $250 fine to the teacher. In Kentucky, education of slaves was legal but almost non-existent. Some Missouri slaveholders educated their slaves or permitted them to do so themselves. In Utah, slave owners were required to send black slaves to school for 18 months between the ages of 6 and 20 years, and Indian slaves for 3 months every year. Now, I want to talk a little bit about their medical treatment. The quality of medical care to slaves is uncertain. Some historians conclude that because slaveholders wished to preserve the value of their slaves, they received the same care as whites did. Others conclude that medical care was poor. A majority of plantation owners and doctors balanced a plantation need to get as much labor as possible from a slave without causing death. Infertility or reduction in productivity, the effort by planters and doctors to provide sufficient living resources that enabled their slave to remain productive and bear many children. The impact of diseases and injury on the social stability of slave communities, the extent to which illness and mortality of subpopulation in slave society reflected their different environmental exposure and living circumstances. Some of the slaves, they would treat themselves and others with the remedies that was left by their or taught by their elders, and they would use those remedies to help each other. Also, large enough plantations with owners willing to spend the money would often have primitive infirmaries built to deal with the problems of slaves' health. Now, I want to talk about the brutality that was being faced by African slaves. William Dunway notes that slaves were often punished for their failure to demonstrate due difference and submission to whites. Demonstrating pointless and humility showed the slave was submitting to the established racial and social order, while failure to follow them demonstrated insolence and a threat to the social hierarchy. Dunway observes that slaves were punished almost as often for symbolic violations of the social order as they were for physical failures. Two-thirds of whippings were done for social offense versus one-third of physical offenses, such as low productivity or property losses. Besides slaves being vastly overworked, they suffered brandings, shootings, floggings, and much worse punishments. Flogging was a term often used to describe the average lashing or whipping a slave would receive for misbehaving. Many a times, a slave would also simply be put through wanton cruelties or unprovoked violent beatings or punishments. Child workers. Children, of course, could not go to school like adults, usually expected to work to their physical limits. It was completely legal to exploit children, to work them brutally, to whip them, and to use them sexually. Even very young children could be given tasks such as gardening flocks or carrying water to the field hands. Now I want to show you a picture of Gordon, a whipped Louisiana slave photographed in April 1863, and also a bill of sale of a black kid named Jacob for $80 and a half, equivalent to 1,406 in 2019, to satisfy a money judgment against the property of his owner, Prettyman Boyce. On October 10th, 1807. Now let's see who was considered an ideal slave for whites. Who maintains strict discipline and unconditional submission, create a sense of personal inferiority so that slaves know their place, instill fear, teach servants to take interest in their master's enterprise, prevent access to education and reaction, to ensure that slaves remain uneducated, helpless, and dependent. Now at the end, I want to read something out to you that will not only break your heart, but it will probably make you cry. This is the story of a little black boy, Joe. Joe's mother was ordered to dress him in his best Sunday clothes and send him to the house, where he was sold like the hogs at so much per pound. When her son started for Pittsburgh, she pleaded that her boy not be taken from her, but master quieted her by telling that he was going to town with a wagon and would be back in the morning. Morning came, but little Joe did not return to his mother. Morning after morning passed, and the mother went down to the grave without ever seeing her child again. One day, she was even whipped for grieving for her little boy. At the end, my friends, let's remember all those who went through hardship, humiliated, lost family members just because of some people who thought they were superior to everybody else.